I am a battalion chief with the City of Raleigh Fire Department. I'm also the founder and the director of the North Carolina Peer Support Team. I got my master's from UNC Pembroke, and I was able to study a lot on first responder mental health and suicide. And through that, I really dove deep into peer support and how we could just serve ourselves and other first responders better. When I was in graduate school, I was given an action research assignment. It basically find an area where current practices are not best practices, research, and help develop better practices. I reached out to one of our chief officers that I respected and asked him for a topic, and he suggested firefighter suicide. Ironically, at that time, I was going through a really just crappy time in my life. I was pretty depressed, and I had thought about suicide, but I was so ashamed of that thought that I just silenced it and isolated myself. I didn't know where to turn or who to talk to out of that embarrassment. So for me, diving into the research on it was really helpful. But also diving into the research, I realized that this was an area that we were not addressing well, and that there were many other first responders struggling who didn't have anywhere to go. And a lot of departments just didn't know best practices. So it became a passion project of mine. Lexipol teamed up with the Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, and they put out a webinar a few years ago on Words Matter. And since then, I've followed the Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, and especially their best practices and their recommendations. And one of the things that they recommended that just didn't seem obvious at first, but now is really clear, is that when we frame it, we have to avoid framing it as, an inevitability of the job, or trying to pinpoint and blame our job for either mental health or even suicide. So the biggest recommendation is that when we frame this, when we discuss this, we have to make sure that we are including a positive message, and that how many people have recovered, how many people have struggled with mental health, struggled with thoughts of suicide, and have found a path to recovery. Because when we frame it this way, those out there who are struggling find out that there's hope. And the most fascinating thing that I learned in all of my work with suicide prevention and mental health is that hope is truly the antidote to a lot of our problems. Just having a little hope and knowing that there is a way forward gives us that ability to take those steps forward. When we frame it in a way where we say things like more firefighters die by suicide than in the line of duty, or it's a firefighter crisis, when we use that language, that person out there who's struggling hears it, and they believe that suicide's the only option. They believe that that is where they're going to end up. So we have to be really careful in how we communicate this message. Mental health disorders are really common. And if addressed and understood, we can move forward. And we have to look at maybe what are some mental health disorders that first responders may be more susceptible to, and what are the links. So, for example, something we know now is sleep deprivation. Truly impacts our mental health. A lot of people don't realize that sleep is absolutely critical for mental and physical health. And it's not just a little bit of sleep, it's a full night of sleep. Sleep has two different parts. Basically, you have your non-rapid eye movement sleep, and then you have your rapid eye movement sleep. Rapid eye movement sleep happens at the end of the night. And that is basically what the scientists call inbuilt therapy. When somebody is in rapid eye movement sleep, the REM sleep, traumatic memories actually are separated. The trauma, the emotional response is separated from the memory to where the memory is stored without the physical reaction. If you don't get yourself REM sleep, if you consistently sleep less than 6 hours, which most first responders do, you're increasing your likelihood of having PTSD. And they found that sleep disorders are associated with every mental health disorder. So with that knowledge, we've got to get a message out that sleep is important. And not just that, but how do we improve our sleep? We have to focus on increasing the environmental design to where suicide is just harder. And that's everything from, like you just mentioned, now that we know that sleep and sleep disorders contribute to mental health and contribute to suicide, our departments, our leadership, building everything, a systems approach has to be taken to design firehouses to where we can maximize sleep. But on top of that, little things like if you have two different engines, or an engine and a ladder at a firehouse, only one of them is awoken if there's a call. And this is controversial, But we know that most first responders, when they die by suicide, it's with a firearm. So another environmental design is making it harder to have access to that firearm, especially in the hours where suicides are more common between 12 and 4 a.m. The times when suicides can be more common, after a divorce, if there's been a major loss. So in understanding these things, we have to learn how to educate and communicate with first responders. They call it means restriction, means safety. There's many different ways, but basically building time and distance between somebody struggling and their means, such as a firearm. So something easy, or I guess it's easier said than done. But for example, just knowing that if you keep your firearm locked up, you have to use a couple of seconds, you have to focus, you have to take a few deep breaths before you can access it. So if at 1 a.m, your brain goes in that fight or flight and you have these really deep, dark thoughts, instead of having a gun right beside your bed, having to go to that lockbox, put in the lock, that might be just enough time to think about reasons to not use that gun. Something else that we're working on is just educating people on having conversations when you are worried about somebody. And those conversations, especially when somebody's going through a really difficult time, could include saying, hey, you're going through a really hard time. I'm worried about you. I care about you. Do you mind if I hold on to your weapons for a couple weeks till you get through this time? So that's just another environmental design method that can help reduce suicides, because you're basically just making it harder to die by suicide. Since 2000, for all populations in the United States, suicide rates have gone up over 35%. Not just first responders, but all people. It is truly a public health crisis for all people. And since 2000, we've had more experts and more public awareness campaigns and more information, yet the rates are still going up. So I think we also have to have an open mind to understand that this knowledge is evolving and we have to stay on top of it, and we have to trust our guts, trust our instincts to do the right thing. But I do really appreciate and now understand the messaging of, communicating messages of hope, sharing stories of people who struggled, got help, and were able to move forward beyond that, which we know most people who experience adversity experience growth, especially when they do the right things, like practice self-care, seek counseling when necessary, maintain a tribe, stay connected with others, and just practice all of the positive coping skills out there to practice.